So let's talk about arrays and lists and talk about what you should use in different situations, because their functionality look very much like the same. They both act like lists and can contain a lot of different values, but there is some key difference in an array and a list. So if we start talking about arrays, then these have a fixed size when you initialize them, where on the other hand a list is more dynamic. You don't have to tell it what size it is when you initialize a list. So as you can see on these two examples, I just copy and pasted. This is an array and how you initialize an array, and in this case this array can contain 3 values, which should be int, everyone. And what we say when we initialize an array is that we say what data type that it should contain. Then we make these square brackets, and then we again call it a name of the variable. And then we say we want to add a new integer, and you can see it like an array with 3 items inside. So you have to specify that the array will contain 3 values, or whatever size of the array that you want to have. But on the other hand, when we initialize a list, you can see we have to specify the list class, which is actually inside our system collections generic library, where we can use the list class. And with a list you also have to specify what data type you want in it and say what the variable name should be, or actually the list name. And then again, as we did with the array, you say new, but then you say list, and again what data type, and then we want to close it off with some parentheses. And it's actually very important that they are there, because if we delete them, then this list will not work. But let's go and see how we put values into the array and into the list. So let's start with the array, and as you can see, Visual Studio already suggests that we write numbers array and then say that we want to target the index of 0 and put that to the value 1. So if I hit tab now, it will just write this code. And now you could wonder why it says that the index is 0, but that is because when we talk about index in a list or in an array, then we start with the index 0, and then it will go up to 1 and 2 in this case, because we only have 3 values in our array. So it will have an index of 0, 1 and 2. So if we just tap twice here, you can see that we now put our values of 1, 2 and 3 into the indexes of the array, where it will be in the 0, 1 and 2. But let's try to see how we put the same values inside our numbers list. So let's go down and copy the numbers list, and then what you want to do is actually just say dot and then add, make some parentheses and say what the value should be inside. So in our case we say 1, and we need to close the line off. And again, I'll just copy and paste this line and just type 2 and 3. And as I told you before, we can see now that we can have 3 values in our array, but in our numbers list we have not specified how many items we want in the list. So we can just add all the items that we want to, which also makes it more dynamic. And then you could ask yourself, why do you want to use an array instead of a list? And that would be because that the array is actually more faster to find its index in the memory, and that's just the way it's built up behind the scenes, where we do not see it from our code editor. But there is also a shorter way to initialize an array and a list and put the values in as we initialize it. So now just copy and paste it in some lines again. I copy and pasted this line and this line. And what this line do is that we initialize an array again, but we then just put the values in the same line. So actually this line and all these 3 will be the same as just this one. So you can just make some curly brackets and then just say what the value should be that you want to have in the array. And it's actually just the same with the list. We initialize it as we did before. We say new list and then it should be ints, but instead of these parentheses we make curly brackets where we put the values in. But now let's say that we want to access some of the information that we have in our arrays. So I'll just delete this line and this line again, because we already have this. And then let's try and get the first value from both the array and the list. And the way we will do it is that I want to make an int called first and set that equal to our array, and then again the square brackets, and say that we want to target the index of 0 and then close off the line. So when we target the index of 0 in our array, we will get the value that we set, and it was 1. So this variable will be 1. And we can actually go and say Control D to copy and paste the line, and then just copy our list, because it's actually the same way that we're going to do it. We can call this first list instead, and that's because you also want to target the index like this. So now let's go and try to see if we can get all the values out of the array and the list. So let's make a couple of line more. So we start with the array, where we're going to make a for loop, and then we say that we have an integer that is called I, which will be 0 when this for loop starts. And then we have a condition where we say that when I is less than the length of our array, then it should continue to just loop through this for loop, and then of course increase the I with 1 every time we have looped it through. So by doing this, we can go and say console writeLine, and then target the array that we have, and then target the index in our array by saying that we want to use the I variable. So in the first iteration, we have the 0 value, so it will target the 0 index and get the value of 1, and then it will continue to the next I, and when that is 1, this will return 2 because we have the value 2 in our index number 1, and finally it will go back and say that I is 2, and it will put it in the index. So that would target the index 2, which is the value of 3. And now when our I is 2, then it's actually still less than the length, but then it will increase to be 3. And when it increases to 3, then it's no longer less than our length of our array, because that is also 3. But let's go and see how we loop through a list. And the way we'll do that is actually a little bit more simple. So inside I actually want to say writeLine instead, and then remove this space. So what we can do with the list is that we have a for each loop, and we know that it's an int that we're going to iterate in the list. So we call that number every time it hits a new item in the list, and then we simply display that number. But I think this will cover the basics for what an array and what a list is. And of course, you're not bound to an int. You can also make it a string, or you can make it an object. And in some of the next videos, I'm going to talk about objects so that you can learn some object-oriented programming. So I'll just see you in the next video. Bye.